Hey guys, my name is Franklin Easton. I'm a strongman competitor. I'm a strength coach. I own Iron Strong Performance here in Seattle, Washington. And today I want to talk about structural balance and why I think it's so important, regardless of what your goal is, to include the concept of structural balance in when building a program, in deciding exercise selection, to make sure you get as strong as possible, as safely as possible. The basic idea of what structural balance is to strengthen the body from all angles. We're trying to be balanced with our structure. We don't want one side to be way stronger than the others. We don't want our the front side of our upper body, our pushing muscles, to be way stronger than our pulling muscles. The back side of our upper body. We don't want the front side of our lower body to be much stronger than the back side of our lower body. The biggest reason for that is injury prevention. If one side of the structure is way stronger than the other, the actual joint integrity is way worse. The ability for your joint to create stability, to produce force, is going to be lesser. So your ability to achieve higher end strength is going to be lower. There's a number of downsides to not being structurally balanced, and there's really no downside to being structurally balanced. There's a number of thought processes around structural balance in training. Someone like Charles Poliquin, if any of you've ever run across any of his material, was much more strict on having set percentages of these movements should be X percentage of these movements, and they should be in these ratios. I'm not as big a fan of that style. It is certainly inspired by Charles Poliquin, but it does not retain those percentages. The approach I'm going to explain to you here, I learned from a mentor of mine, Sebastian Oreb, coach of Hafthor Bjornsson, heaviest deadlift of all time, world's strongest man, and his approach to building structural balance, having the body be strong from all angles, so you're able to do extraordinary feats of strength safely with joint integrity. I'm going to start off with the simplest approach for building structural balance, or the simplest rule of thumb to start building structural balance into your plan, and then slowly layer a little bit of complexity onto it. So there's a little bit more depth and a little bit more accuracy in what I'm saying, because just going into, we need to perform every joint action with load to train all the possible muscles and through every possible joint angle is far too excessive to really build a plan off of. So here is the basic version of it, and we're going to start to slowly add more things to it. The basic version is to have a 4-category exercise model where most of the movements we do in the gym fit into 4 basic categories: push, pull, hinge, squat. We have 2 upper body categories, 2 lower body categories, 2 front side of the body categories, 2 back side of the body categories. We're initially starting to create some stability front, back, top, bottom, which are usually the 2 biggest areas people have issues with. Your classic bench bro just does pushing exercises, has absolutely no strength in the back of their body. There's quite a few athletes going through various strength conditioning programs that I've talked to who have really strong front of the legs. Their squat is really strong. They have not deadlifted at all. The backside of the leg is very weak. For the gym bro, usually they run into shoulder issues. For the athlete I described, there's often knee issues associated with that. What I find is much more solid is to have a relative balance in training between these 4 categories. So just to give some examples, we have push. This would be your bench press, your dumbbell press, your overhead press, anything where you're using your upper body to push things away from you, using mainly the front side of your body muscles. You have pulling movements where you use your upper body to pull things towards you. That's going to be your lat pull downs, your rows, your dumbbell rows, cable rows, barbell rows, your pull-ups, your high rows, anything where you're using your body to use the back side of your body muscles to pull things towards you. Face pulls would also fit in that category. You have your squat pattern movements, which are lower body movements, which bias towards the front side of the lower body. Those are going to be your high bar back squats, low bar back squats, front squats, lunges, Bulgarian split squats, that whole category of movements, leg extensions. And then you have your hinge category movements, which are movements that train the lower body, biasing towards the back side of the lower body. Your conventional deadlifts, your sumo deadlifts, your hip extensions, your RDLs, your hamstring curls, that whole category of movements. With that basic approach, you're starting to see we're strengthening front, back of the body, top out of the body. And so long as we put them in relative importance to each other, or relatively similar importance to each other within a training program, we're going to end up with a pretty balanced structure overall. We don't want to have we're doing pushing and we're doing pulling, but we're doing 10 sets of pushing, we're doing 2 sets of pulling throughout the entire week. The thing that I try to aim for is having a similar number of sets between pushing and pulling, between squatting and hinging. In a lot of cases, but not in all cases, also between pushing and squatting, hinging and pulling, so that all 4 of those categories have a roughly similar amount of volume. Now, as people get really strong, as people have various goals, that's not always the case, but as a really good starting point, as a place to begin structural balance, I think having all 4 categories with roughly the equal amount of volume via sets is a really good place to start. So now I'm going to start to layer a little bit more complexity, a little bit more depth on this. So we're going to take our 4 category model and we're going to split each of those 4 categories into 2 different categories. So now we have an 8 category model. So we start to split the pushing exercises into 2 basic categories. We have horizontal push and vertical push. Your horizontal push is going to be things like bench presses, flat dumbbell presses, low incline dumbbell presses. Your vertical push is going to be things like standing overhead press, dumbbell shoulder press, machine shoulder press, anything where you're pressing in more of a vertical path. There are obviously ones kind of in the middle, like one of those middle inclines. It can be debatable. Usually I arbitrarily pick the cutoff at 45 degrees. It's more than 45, it's vertical. Less than 45, it's horizontal. But somewhere in that range, it can be a little bit more of a middle ground. But those 2 basic categories of being more horizontal, more vertical, trying to strengthen the shoulders from more angles. Going on to pulling, very similarly, we have a vertical pull and a horizontal pull. Your vertical pull is going to be your pull-ups, your lat pull downs. That's largely it. There's a couple other ones. High rows are debatable. But then your horizontal rowing, that's going to be your dumbbell rows, your barbell rows, your cable rows, anything where you're pulling more horizontally. The squat category, we have 2 categories for the squat patterns. We have knee dominant squat patterns. So for most people, if they're doing a closer stance, high bar squat, usually some sort of heel elevation, and they're getting a fair bit of knee bend, that's going to be a relatively quad dominant or knee dominant squat pattern. If you're doing a front foot elevated static lunge, a relatively knee dominant squat pattern. If you're doing a leg extension, very knee dominant squat pattern because there's no other joints involved. Compared to if someone's doing a wider stance low bar squat, someone's doing a Bulgarian split squat, these are more hip dominant squat patterns. And I won't get super into the weeds of all that's involved with a hip dominant squat pattern in this video. That can be a video of its own right later on. But the key piece being how much of the squat pattern, which still generally biases towards the front side of the leg, is on specifically the quads versus the other muscles that help you stand upright from a squat pattern. This is where it does get a little bit murky when you start looking at some of the hinge patterns and some of the squat patterns start to be more of a blend than they otherwise would be, and more of a blend than you see in the upper body as well. It's just part of how the differences of the function of the upper and lower body here. So then moving on, so we have the squat pattern, knee dominant squat, hip dominant squat, very similar to the upper body where we have the vertical and horizontal. For the hinge pattern, we also have hip and knee dominant. Now, for hip dominant hinge, that's going to be like your deadlifts, your RDLs, your hip extensions, anything we are straightening the hip using the muscles on the backside of our lower body to do so. With the there isn't really a knee dominant hinge. It's not a totally accurate thing to say. What goes in that slot is knee flexion movements, things where you're bending the knee. Hamstring curls, Nordic hamstring curls are really the main ones. But just any movement where you're training a bent knee position, that is what fits in that last slot there. It's an additional layer of importance on top of training the body from different sides and training those muscles from different angles, even though something like a lat pull down and a cable row train largely the same muscles. They are training those muscles through different ranges of motion, and they're training those joints through different ranges of motion. And there is some difference in which muscles are biased, which muscles are emphasized. But the thing that I think is more important to emphasize there is what are the ranges that these things are being taken through, and particularly for the joints, particularly when we're thinking about strength as a consequence, rather than just something like hypertrophy, where muscle size is the only thing that matters. When we're starting to think about performance and ability, strength is range of motion specific. If you are a very strong at pulling, but you've never done a lat pull down before, you might have trouble just being in that position and creating control at that angle. Your body has never had to create stability there. You don't see that as often, but the one that you see very often is some very, very high level bench pressers who are world class in being able to bench press are terrible overhead pressers. They don't have the mobility to do it because they haven't been training that position to be with their hands overhead. They don't have particularly good strength there. They don't have very good control at their shoulders. We'll get a little bit into the shoulder blade and shoulder functions here, not extensively, but a little bit here to round out some of the structural balance conversations. But the positions of the shoulder, particularly the shoulder blade and how it rotates through range of motions overhead, starts to add a lot of complexity that's not in some of the horizontal pressing movements. So when you start to strengthen these muscles through, or strengthen these patterns through ranges of motion that they otherwise would not have access to, or that they would not get seen if you stick to just of the 4-category model, if you were just using that and you happen to only select movements that were from one of the 2 in the 8-category model, so all of your pulls were horizontal, all of your presses were horizontal, you're going to be missing out on general strength development. I do think you're going to be missing out on muscle mass development as well. But I think the more concerning thing, in my opinion, is just the lack of function that you're going to have with anything that's not in this plane. Once you start to reach more vertically, it's going to be harder and harder for you to get access to that position and be able to create control and stability there. Continuing to add a little bit more depth into the structural balance conversation, I'm going to add a 9th category to the list. So you have the push, pull, hinge, squat, vertical, horizontal, knee, hip. Adding a 9th category, which is more shoulder focused, which is shoulder health movements. It's really a broad category, doesn't tell you a whole lot, but it's trying to fill in some of the gaps that are created from just horizontal push pull, vertical push pull. Now, the shoulder is the most mobile joint in the body, and we won't get wildly into the weeds of its structure and function. Take, for example, a bench press and a cable row. You are training your pushing muscles, you're training your pulling muscles, you are training them just in the horizontal track, but let's leave that as a side for right now. One of your main movers for the bench press is going to be your pec. One of your main movers for the row is going to be your lat. Your pec goes from along the sternum to the upper arm right here, the humerus. That's right about there. Your lat goes from actually low back. It's much lower than people think where it attaches, and then it runs underneath the armpit, attaches also pretty close to the pec, right on the front of the upper arm, the humerus right there. Because of that placement, both of them actually internally rotate the shoulder. They go this way when they fully contract. As such, if you get the pec and lat continually stronger over time, your shoulder will be pulled into internal rotation. What we want to do to counter that, much like we want to make sure we're not being pulled forward by the pushing muscles being too strong, or pulled excessively back by the pulling muscles being too strong, which I've never seen, but certainly could exist theoretically, is making sure that our external rotators are strong. We don't want to be pulled into internal rotation excessively. We want to make sure our external rotation is relatively strong here. So what I recommend with that is training external rotation, specifically doing some sort of seated dumbbell external rotation, doing some sort of cable external rotation, elbow low, elbow high, doing some face pulls, doing a variety of different external rotation movements at different shoulder angles to prioritize different of the external rotators. The main ones being elbow low, elbow high, and then elbow supported high are the main categories I want to make sure somebody hits. So I won't get too into the weeds there, but those are we can continue to fracture all day long, and I want to make sure that this video does in fact have a end. The other part that I would put under shoulder health movements is going to be serratus anterior movements. The serratus anterior is a muscle that runs on top of the shoulder, on top of the rib cage, underneath the shoulder blade. It helps control the shoulder blade as it moves, but particularly it pulls the shoulder blade forward and up. Basically directly opposite of what a lot of our pulling movements do. The assumption with all of this is that we're doing these movements to what I consider to be good technique. So all of our pulling motions are done with our shoulders being pulled fully back and down. As we get that position stronger and stronger, we are not particularly training the muscles that pull the shoulder blade up and forwards, mainly the serratus anterior, and that can lead to some restrictions in the motion of the shoulder blade. The shoulder blade needs to be able to smoothly move for our shoulder to be able to get overhead, to be able to do more complicated actions. We don't want it moving for the bench press. We do want it moving for an overhead press or just daily life. So making sure the serratus anterior stays healthy. We do some direct serratus anterior targeting movements. Very helpful. My personal favorite is a torch raise, sometimes called a serratus anterior raise, for strengthening that specific area to keep that moving well. A couple of the other areas after shoulder health that I'll go into, touch on very briefly. I do consider them less important or less critical. There are certain people who they are really, really important for, but they are less universal. I think shoulder health and the big 4 and the big 8 categories are really essential. Everyone should be doing those. But once you get past those 9, so you have the initial 4, push, pull, hinge, squat. You have the 8, vertical for push, pull, vertical, horizontal, hip and knee for hinge and squat. And then we add the 9th shoulder health category. Those are pretty much what I would consider borderline mandatory for being a human. Once we get past that, there are a couple additional ones that I don't know if everybody needs to do, but can be really valuable for some. You're going to have core training in that, which is going to be, you can actually split into 6 different categories between moving and non-moving. And then for both moving and non-moving, you're going to have, what is the plane of resistance? Is it forward, backwards? Is it side, side? Is it rotational? You're going to have your wrist and hand related training. You can get down a number of rabbit holes when it comes to hands and wrists because we have such dexterity in our hands that can get really tricky to get in the weeds of. And I won't get into all the potential splits that you can start to create there. But hand and wrist training, all categories, just broadly as one big thing, and leave that off to the side for right now. Neck training, which will be forward, backwards, side, side, and rotational. There'll be some ankle training as well, doing both plantar flexion. A lot of people will want to train their calves, making sure if you're going to train your calves, doing both knee bent and knee straight. When you have the straight knee, you bias more towards the upper calf. When you have the bent knee, you bias more towards the lower calf. Soleus is the lower calf, gastroc is the upper calf. If you're going to do plantar flexion is the pointing the toe. If you're going to do the pointing the toe, doing flexing the toe as well, dorsiflexion, like a tibialis anterior raise. It's relatively annoying to do without having specialized equipment, which I fortunately have here. But if you have access to that, training that directly, or you can do it off of a wall, but it's hard to load and progress. And then the other function of the ankle, inversion and eversion. Inversion being bring your big toe towards your middle, eversion being pinky toe out. Training those functions as well. The tib bar that I use to train the tibialis anterior works excellently to strengthen the inversion and eversion as well. If you don't have one of those, also very annoying. You can set up some stuff with bands, but it's kind of hard to pull off. But I do think it's helpful to have that full strength in the ankle, particularly if someone's going to be doing a standing-based sport. If someone's a field sport athlete, a combat athlete, a strongman competitor, they're going to be on their feet and be asked to produce high amounts of force through their feet with potentially varying directions. That can be very valuable. But if someone just wants to get generally stronger, they want to move a bit better, they want to feel a bit better, it's a little bit less critical there. I don't think it's an absolutely required movement, but I do think the initial 4, 8, and then 9 category model is one that should be generally universally applied for basically everybody. So that's why we started with the more simple approach, starting to add a little bit more layers of nuance and depth here. Hopefully this helps you figure out how to build a body that's strong from all angles, where you're not just all pushing muscles, you're not all just pulling muscles, you're not all front side of lower body or back side of the lower body. We are balanced between upper and lower, front and back. We are strong from all angles. And then if you really want to get into the details of being strong from all angles, and I know with my additional list of things, I did not hit everything. There are certainly other movement patterns and directions that we could train. This is why just doing it as a train every movement pattern, train every joint angle, train everything is just not viable. Starting to create some of these models makes it a lot easier to know what you're hitting and what you're not. And you don't necessarily need to be hitting something all of the time. You don't necessarily need to have every potential category, that box checked every time you train. But just over the course of a training year, you should be hitting a lot of those. It should be relatively well distributed, but more of the focus being towards push, pull, hinge, squat is going to give you the most results that most people are looking for most goals. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this was a informative video. If you have any questions, if you'd like any more detail, please feel free to leave a comment. I'll get back to all the ones that I can. I'd be happy to help you explain or add some context to any of these ideas.